Hi everybody, Mr. Mahadi here to talk about the first part of our carbon cycle notes. So, very first thing we need to do before we get going anywhere is that huge blank box at the top of your carbon cycle notes. I need you to either pause this video right now or take a screenshot of this picture and draw your own picture inside that carbon cycle, the big box there at the top. Couple key things you should have in there. You should have a water source of some kind. It doesn't need to be exactly the same as my picture. We need to have a factory in there. We also need to have some sort of plant material like my trees right here, and an animal. You get to choose. So if you want to do a bear or a deer or something else, I did a giraffe because giraffes are awesome. And then I drew a person down here as well, and some black spots down here for my fossil fuels. So pause the video right now. You should draw in your sketch, and then we will put the notes together. Okay, so if you're at this part of the video, you are ready to go with your notes. So your picture is drawn. It's hopefully half as good as mine. We can always hope. And we are going to get through these notes right here. We have some stuff on the right sides as well. And then all the way down to this purple line right here. That's the goal of this video. So let's get right into it. So, carbon cycle. First of all, organic carbon. All life forms, you and me, your dog, your cat, fish, a little insect, snakes, everything, all life forms are part of the biosphere, and they are all made of carbon. So, for example, DNA, deoxyribonucleic acid right here. These helixes are made up of carbon. Glucose, sugar that plants need to get energy, made up of carbon. So all life forms are obviously in the biosphere, and all of us are made up of carbon. So simplified carbon cycle, looking at that carbon cycle on the right of your notes, it says the diagram below is a simplified version of the carbon cycle. How many spheres are involved in the carbon cycle? And then you need to list an example from each sphere on the right. So go ahead and do that now. Think about the carbon cycle game. How many spheres were interacting during the carbon cycle game? And then using that picture on the right, write down an example of each: the atmosphere, the geosphere, the hydrosphere, and the biosphere. So pause the video right now, get that stuff on the right done, and then we'll jump back into the notes. Okay, so now we're moving to the non-living environment. We started in the biosphere, talking about how all of us are made of carbon. Now we're going to go to the non-living environment. So first, something we've talked about a couple times already. Carbon dioxide exists in the atmosphere. So how can we find carbon in the non-living environment? As CO2, there's that C right there, in the atmosphere. And remember, I know we've only done this a couple times, but everything that I have underlined here should be written in your notes. Next, carbon is found in the non-living environment as carbonic acid in the hydrosphere. We're going to talk a lot more about this guy in the next coming units. And then finally, as various fossil fuels in the geosphere. So that completes our first page of notes. Now we're on to the next page. We're going to start with fossil fuel formation. So how do fossil fuels form? That's a lot of F's all right in a row. Over millions of years, heat and pressure can transform decayed organic material, or organic matter, which is just plants, decayed plants, into fossil fuels like coal, oil, and natural gas. We've talked about this a little bit already this year, but these are the things you need to write down. Heat and pressure over time squishes these plants together, as you can see in this drawing. This decaying organic matter gets squished and buried by sediment until over time it turns into fossil fuels. And depending on the type of plant that's being crushed and stuck together over time, we might get coal, which is all plant matter. We could get oil or some natural gas too. Okay, So the first half of the carbon cycle we're looking at are things that add carbon to the atmosphere. So everything that we're going to talk about in this video is putting carbon from somewhere into the atmosphere. So the first one, the release of CO2 through breathing by not only humans, but plants, animals, and most bacteria as well. So each time you and I take a breath, each time your dog pants after a long run, we add CO2 to the atmosphere. And even plants add CO2 to the atmosphere by breaking down that sugar to get energy. This is how all organisms get usable energy. So we need to breathe to get usable energy. So respiration is our first adding to the atmosphere. Next one is combustion. Combustion is the burning of fossil fuels. So maybe you've heard of like a combustion engine or a combustion reaction. All of those is some sort of ignition, the burning of fossil fuels. And some of those fossil fuels that are burned are things like gasoline, like in your car, methane gas, propane, maybe in a grill, oil, and coal. So I want you to think about a couple examples of combustion. I said write 3 on the right side of your notes. I've given you 2 right here. One of them is driving a car. The other one is using electricity. Maybe you could think about heating your home. Maybe you could think about like the bus that took you to get here. Maybe plugging in your Xbox, anything like that. Turning on your stove, so on and so forth. So write 3 of those examples on the right where it says examples of combustion. Now next, let's talk about decomposition. So decomposition is the decay of dead plants and animals. And remember how earlier we said bacteria use up oxygen and release CO2? That's exactly what's happening here. As bacteria are breaking down both plants and animals, it releases some CO2 into the atmosphere, but like look at these mushrooms right here. They're connected down here through this plant to the soil. So they actually release some of the CO2 into the soil as well. Some goes up into the atmosphere, some goes down into the soil. So it's actually releasing CO2 into 2 different places. So that's decomposition, the breaking down of dead plants and animals. Okay, next, let's talk deforestation here. Cutting down and burning trees releases carbon into the atmosphere. So this is called a slash and burn technique. So burning these trees, when we cut them down, releases CO2 into the atmosphere. After that, we have diffusion. This one can get a little tricky. So this allows carbon to transfer in and out of the oceans. So that's what we're talking about is the oceans right now, by movement of atoms from higher to lower concentrations. This occurs primarily through upwelling currents. So the ocean mixes in CO2 in the atmosphere by literally upwelling currents causing waves and grabbing that CO2 and bringing it down into the ocean. So all that this means is that it's going to move from a high concentration, which means all of these dots are in here in a tight amount of space, to a low concentration. You see how there's only 3 over here. So it's going to, over time, even out to about 50-50. So right now, the reason why this is adding carbon to the atmosphere is that some places in the ocean, there's higher amounts of CO2 in the ocean than there is in the atmosphere. So what the process of diffusion is telling us is that some of this CO2 is actually going to diffuse out into the atmosphere. So that would be an example of a way where we could add carbon to the atmosphere. And we're not done with diffusion yet. Diffusion is going to come back here in the next video. And of course, next is volcanic eruptions. And finally, cement production. So cement production is something that often gets overlooked, but cement actually produces a ton of CO2. Okay, so that is all of the things for removing carbon from the atmosphere. adding carbon to the atmosphere. So we need to add this to our drawing now. All of the things that I'm going to put arrows for that are going into the atmosphere, I'm going to use purple for. I think it's easier to just have one color to show all of the things that are going into the atmosphere. So let's start out by at the top writing this cloud is representing CO2 in the atmosphere. So let's start from the left here. We need to write about deforestation, diffusion, respiration, combustion, decomposition, and fossil fuel formation, since all those things were talked about in the previous notes. So let's start easily enough with deforestation. So right here, I've drawn a tree that's been chopped down. So that deforestation, that process of chopping down the trees, is going to send CO2 from the biosphere into the atmosphere. So we can write deforestation. Yes, I would like you to both draw the arrow and label it. So deforestation is going from the chopping down of trees into the atmosphere. A little slash and burn action there. Okay, next is diffusion. Remember, diffusion's talking about water. So we can zoom in on our little water right here. Diffusion is going from high concentrations in the water to the atmosphere. So you can draw an arrow from the hydrosphere into the atmosphere, and then we can write diffusion. So that's our second one, going into the atmosphere. Next, we have respiration. Well, respiration is the product of breathing. So each time we take a breath in and exhale out, we are adding CO2 into the atmosphere. So all of these breaths that we're taking go into the atmosphere, and this is respiration. But it's not just animals that do this. Like, totally, this giraffe is in there too, and also these plants are also in there. So these trees and animals and plants, all of us living things respire. We go through the process of respiration. Okay, next we have combustion. Well, combustion happens when we take fossil fuels and we burn them. And one of the most common ways that that happens is in your car, or in this case, in a factory. So the factory is burning coal or burning natural gas. This would be combustion. All right, we're almost there, people. Thanks for hanging in there. Next is decomposition. Okay, we got to zoom in on our tree that's being decomposed by these little mushroom dudes here. So remember, we talked about decomposition as the breaking down of dead plants and animals. Well, this tree has died. It's been chopped down and just left there, so it's died. So we have decomposition going into the atmosphere. Let's write that down. Decomposition. But we can't forget that, yeah, some of it goes into the atmosphere, but some of it also goes into the soil. So we need to make arrows for that too, because we can't forget about that. So some of that CO2 gets shoved into the soil, something we call a carbon sink. And then our last one, fossil fuel formation. This isn't necessarily a process going in or out of the atmosphere, but these are our fossil fuel reserves down here. So fossil fuel formation happens from this heat and pressure on the dead and decayed plant material, squishes it together, so then we get fossil fuels right down here. And we're going to use those fossil fuels in the next video. So that's what our carbon cycle looks like so far. In the next video, we're going to go through things that are removing carbon from the atmosphere, and then maybe take a look at which one there are more of. And we'll talk about transfers then too.